Hey everybody, here's your last lecture for Friday, May 24th. Sorry I went into three videos, but I felt like the second one was getting a little long, so I wanted to just give you a little break before doing the last couple slides here of the PowerPoint and cover the last little bit of your reading information. So what I left off with on the last slide was about Catherine Beecher and her book on calisthenics, for the physiology and calisthenics for schools and families, very specifically focused on women and making or helping and encouraging women to be happy and healthy in their homes, so that they could then make their homes happy and healthy in return. So it was pretty novel concept, very progressive idea. To encourage women to get into physical activity, and this notion that they needed to be healthy. Because of course at this time, when this book came out, and later then when Frances Willard wrote her book about riding a bicycle, teaching yourself how to ride a bicycle, there was all this counter research being produced that exercise was bad for women, that it actually harmed their bodies. It decreased their opportunity to have children. It messed up their uterus, and it would silly things like these medical researchers would say things like, if you went swimming, your uterus would fall out. If you rode a bicycle, it would damage your vagina, and you wouldn't be able to then carry children. I mean, these were ridiculous things that were being said about women that we sort of laugh at today, because everybody knows the benefits of exercise, and that transcends sex, gender, physiology, that it makes everyone's physiology better. It makes us more healthy. And so when those types of things were being stated from medical professionals or researchers, it was very confusing to people, that it seemed okay for women to be physically active, to recreate, to take on any kind of activity that forced their bodies to be physical beings, be athletic beings. So Catherine Beecher's book was very progressive for the fact that it was solely focused on women, and it encouraged women to be physically active through this calisthenics training. So what Catherine Beecher did was that she actually opened schools for women in the 1830s. And she included calisthenics as part of the curriculum, and then later wrote this book that became revolutionary. So we saw for the first time physical education in an educational setting that Catherine Beecher encouraged. Now, it wasn't what we think of today as physical education, what we come to know as physical education, but it was certainly the beginnings of what it looked like to include a physical activity for women in the educational setting, the school setting. So what this ended up spurring and setting off is a series of schools out east, higher educational institutions, colleges, that designed fitness-based coursework for their female students. And the first colleges that took part in that are the ones that you see on your slide show. Wellesley College was the very first school that implemented physical education programming for women. Vassar College was very close behind. These are sort of the forerunners in the endeavor of creating physical education programming for women. Developed then team sports for women to participate in, as well as some of those individual sports that we've already talked about, like tennis and archery, golf, croquet, but also they included things like rowing and equestrian. Bowling was one of the activities that they did. So these were activities that these schools were implementing in their educational programming to demonstrate the fact that they did believe women needed this part of their education as well. So educating the mind educating the body as much as they're educating the mind. So Wellesley and Vassar College were single-sex institutions. They are part of what is known as the Seven Sister Schools. These were like the sister Ivies. This is what these schools are known as. They are small private liberal arts institutions, much like Wittenberg. And so they really did they were progressive minded anyway, because they were institutions that dedicated their curriculum to teaching women, educating women. And so, of course, then adding this curriculum of physical education became really a very progressive idea, and was, it aided in the liberation of women who were getting educated, not just intellectually, but also physically educated. So most of these schools now are co-ed, not all of them, but most of those all women's colleges, of the sister Ivies, a lot of them are co-ed now, but their history and when they developed these programs for women educationally were single-sex institutions. Meanwhile, at Smith College, which is another one of these private liberal arts colleges that was all women back in the day, we saw the start and the emergence of women's basketball. So there's a woman noted, her name is Senda Berenson, and then Clara Newcomb is talked about in your book as well. And I actually will talk about her later in the, when we talk about the basketball section, we talk about pioneers. Well, so I'm going to talk about her later, but Senda Berenson is worth noting here because she is considered, she's considered the mother of basketball, women's basketball. And we say the mother of women's basketball because she actually took James Naismith's version of basketball, which had been developed a year prior in 1891. And she, as a physical education instructor already, who worked with women already to promote physical fitness and to encourage women to participate in sport and competitive sport and team sport, she took the version of James Naismith's style of basketball, which was a full court version that we know today, and adapted it for women. So she changed the rules so that it would be more acceptable for people to identify women as playing the sport of basketball. And she implemented it at Smith College and started the trend at other institutions to start team sports, and basketball was sort of the biggest first known team sport to really emerge across the country at institutions, not just single-sex institutions, but same-sex institutions also, this team sport of basketball for women to participate in. So the things that she did to change the rules, I'm pretty sure most of you understand how basketball is played full court. There's 5 on the court at a time for each team, and at one time you're either playing offense or defense, and when you switch onto the floor, you switch playing from offense to defense, whichever you were playing according to whichever you were playing on the opposite end of the floor. And what Senda Berenson did is that she actually split the court into 3 sections, and you only played in one section of the floor. So heaven forbid you should run the full length of the floor. We don't want to see women do that. That's too much exertion. And they stayed in their one sort of section of the floor. There were a limited amount of times that they could dribble the ball, and then depending on where they were on the floor is what they could do on the floor. So if you were in the front court of your team's side of the floor, which is where you would shoot and score, you were an offensive player, and all you did was shoot. You could dribble a couple times before you then either had to pass or shoot, and then the 3 that played against you. So there's only 3 of you on that front court, and the three that played against you were the defenders, and they were trying to stop you from scoring. If they were successful, if they were successful in stopping you, or when you scored, the defense would pass it to their teammates in the middle of the court, where there were 3 of them, and then 3 from the other team, who then became defenders as the ball moved up the court to the other end of the floor to the next set of offensive players, right? So you had 3 on offense, 3 in the middle court, and 3 on defense at all times during the game, and you never left your segment of the floor, your third of the floor. You had, no matter what part of the floor it was in, anytime you caught the ball, you only had a few dribbles that you were allowed to use at a time. Then you had to give up possession of the basketball or take a shot, right? And so that was how they played the sport when Senda Berenson adapted it for women. And it was obviously a very slow-paced game. There wasn't a whole lot of scoring. Actually, the first known extramural game, a game of one school against another school, was between Stanford and Berkeley. So this was out on the West Coast. And the final score of that game was 2-1. They played that game in front of about 500 people, which is actually pretty amazing. But they were all female spectators. They wouldn't allow men to come in and observe them to play. And then after they played the game, that ended in a rousing 2-1 score. They had like a social time, and I'll talk more about what that looked like because this is what we know as play dates. I'll talk more about what that looked like as we talk about Title IX and how the competition arena switched and changed for women. In the post-Title IX era. So anyway, so Vassar and Wellesley College were known for their educational programming that they started, and then Smith College for more of the team development, and Senda Berenson specifically with basketball. And that's kind of the oldest known team sport that developed for women at the college level. That was pretty clearly structured, and so that's why we look at that as a pretty significant time in the history of college sports and women participation in that sport. So what happened with basketball's emergence is that it sort of spurred other team sport participation by women in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And really after 1880 is when we look at a time when there was these team sports starting to emerge for women to participate in. Some of it happened like at a community level, and then after basketball sort of set fire and ignited this idea of team sport opportunity in the college educational setting, then we started to see more team sports developing also in that realm too, in an educational realm. So you can see on the one slide in your slideshow, we talk about lacrosse, which actually has its origins with Native Americans, but the first women's game was played in 1886 in a community in the northeast part of the United States. And that was a sport that we saw a growth in, which was interesting because while it was one of the earlier team sports for women, it really didn't grow and progress like some of these other sports for women that I'm going to talk about here in a moment until recently. In like the last decade, we've seen women's lacrosse has actually been one of the fastest growing emerging sports for girls and women across the United States. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit of history that lacrosse was an original sport that we saw women participate in as a team sport, but it really didn't have and gain a lot of popularity initially until about the 1990s, late 1990s, 2000s, and now we've seen that growing faster than any other team sport for women in the United States of America. Softball is another team sport that was actually created on Thanksgiving Day in Chicago by a man who actually was hanging out with a bunch of buddies that were Yale and Harvard grads that were gathering as alums in Chicago for a football game, and for a Harvard Yale football game that was being played in Chicago at the time. And they were sort of hanging around, waiting around, and this guy named George Hancock came up with this idea of taking a boxing glove and pulling it tightly together to make a ball, and then finding a stick or a club. A boating club is actually what he used originally to hit the ball. So it literally was a soft ball that was used with a stick, and it was played indoors initially. And they actually called it originally indoor baseball, but then when they took the concept of the sport and took it outside, this idea of the bigger ball, the softer ball, is how they how they changed the name into softball. And it became its own entity. But women also took advantage of being a part of that sport. It seemed like a popular option for women to take a part of. And then basketball, of course, as I just talked about. It's important to know that James Naismith developed the sport of basketball in 1891, but it was Senda Berenson in 1892, a year later, that adapted it for women with those special rules and different approach to playing. Volleyball was another YMCA developed sport, just like James Naismith's basketball sport was. That was developed by William Morgan, also out in Massachusetts. And this was kind of a game that blended the elements of tennis, baseball, basketball, and handball, and it was meant to be a sport that didn't have a lot of contact and a lot of exertion because it was supposed to be originally for men to play and be able to play kind of in their work business attire. So that's where he thought about raising the tennis net up above the ground, using a handball type ball across the net so it was soft enough to hit and not need a racket or anything like that. They could just use their hands. And originally it was actually called mintonette. That was the original name of the sport as Morgan had identified it. But as people were watching it and watching the ball go across the net back and forth, people started saying like, oh, it was interesting to watch the ball volley across the net. And so they actually then changed the name to volleyball because it seemed very reflective of how the sport was played. So the height of the net was based on just above an average man's height. And the idea was that they wanted something that was physical again, but not contact. But it required people to be agile, be able to move within their space, and only had limited amount of time to get that ball back over to the other side. And so the original rules are fairly close to the rules on how the game is played today, but with the original name of mintonette and changed to volleyball, and the fact that it didn't have contact and was sort of a classy game was one of the reasons it was actually popular and attractive for women to participate in. And then that last team sport is field hockey. The first club of field hockey for women was established in 1887 in England. And so this was another European influence on American soil for women to participate in field hockey. It actually came to America just after the turn of the century in 1902 by a woman by the name of Constance M.K. Appleby. One of the really cool things I think about with this particular notable woman is, and the reason I like to say her name is because she actually came to Wittenberg. In the 1940s, she came to Wittenberg and taught the game of field hockey. We actually have a photo of her. I actually have it in my files of her out on the grass field before it became turf that you guys know of it today. But teaching the sport of field hockey, showing women how to play the sport of field hockey in the college setting. So pretty cool little piece of history that the same woman that brought field hockey over to the United States of America from England and taught it across the country came actually to Wittenberg University and taught it here. So there are other sports too, but these were the ones that kind of had the biggest sort of explosion for women in team sport, in the team sport realm. So what makes those sports pretty special in particular. So the very last slide are organizations that supported women in their pursuit of participating in athletic endeavors. Excuse me, the YWCA, which is akin to the YMCA, was an organization that held the first athletic games for women out in Boston in the early 1880s. And the YMCA then continued to develop and grow. And when the YWCA had its mission developed, the idea was that they were trying to empower women and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. It's why you see the tagline "Eliminating Racism, Empowering Women" as part of their logo. And so one of the things that they really sought to promote was women having and feeling empowered by everything about themselves, and so feeling empowered about their own body, their own physical capabilities. And so they hosted, athletic and physical fitness programming for women, and that was something they became known for and at a community level, right? So this was an opportunity for women who weren't in an educational setting to find programming that was very regular and consistent that they could be a part of no matter what their age and be physically active. So that was really important that the YWCA existed and was able to help women that way. It's actually the YWCA is the oldest and largest multicultural women's organization in the world. So not just in the United States, but actually the very first one was established in London, England, and we took the sort of format, the template from them. And then the last two is the AAU and the National Girls and Women in Sports. AAU was developed in 1888, so a few years after the YWCA was established in Boston. We saw the AAU, which is the Amateur Athletic Union, and then the National Association of Girl and Women in Sports was developed right before the turn of the century in 1899. And both of these organizations support girls' sports. The AAU is probably something you might be familiar with. You either played in AAU or you knew people who played in AAU. You have brothers and sisters. It definitely is a gigantic nonprofit, volunteer-based sport organization. It's the largest one in the United States of America. It was created to develop uniformity in youth sports and produce opportunities for amateur athletes, boys and girls. There's about 500,000 kids that participate between the 9U and 18U age groups that AAU hosts. And then I have the number here, about 50,000 volunteers that are part of AAU. So it is a gigantic organization. And so when it started and was able to support girls participating in sport competitively, that was a big opportunity. And then the National Girls and Women in Sports is an organization that really is dedicated to supporting girls in sports. They are dedicated to advocacy, education, the promotion of girls and women in sport. And so it just really promotes and supports an active, healthy lifestyle. And it's more today like an advocacy group. They provide a lot of educational resources. And their idea is to promote the idea of strong, independent women and female leaders. But it certainly was, again, one of the first organizations, along with the YWCA and the AAU, that helped support girls and women in their endeavor and being part of organized sport. So that's those are the early American precedents. What we saw happening right around the 1900s, so the late 1880s, the 1900s. So this is kind of a build-up to what happened at the turn of the last century until about the mid of the past century, when we started to see the development of Title IX, and that's why we're going to bump into Title IX next week. Because when we talk about Title IX, you'll get some more history on education and why Title IX came into place. So you'll learn a little bit more about what happened between the 1900s and the 1970s when the Title IX law was enacted. So all this is good background for you. All of these things that were going on for women in early America around the 1880s, 90s, and 1900s were sports and activities that continued to exist and promote opportunities for women up until we started to see the changes happening from Title IX. And of course, the influence of the Olympics too, which you're going to learn about after we talk about Title IX. So hopefully you enjoyed these 3 little lectures for today. Hopefully you get a chance to take your quiz. Remember, next week you have a new set of readings that are already posted, so go ahead and get those taken care of, all on Title IX, and we'll see you next week. Enjoy your Memorial Day weekend.